shredded story arcs, tacked-on happy endings, and the most notorious voiceover narration in film history. They say the customer is always right, but what about test audiences? You can tell right away that the theatrical ending of Blade Runner was slapped together at the last minute. Observant fans will notice it contains recycled footage from The Shining. It's also worth noting that this ending gives Deckard a much happier ending than the otherwise dark film might have promised. Ridley Scott wanted to end the movie on a more ambiguous note. Originally, Deckard would have found an origami unicorn left by his boss, Gaff. Since there was no way Gaff could have known about Deckard's recurring dream of a unicorn unless he had programmed the dream himself, this was meant to be a subtle hint that Deckard might be a replicant. However, this ending left test audiences confused, so the studio persuaded Scott to replace it with a much happier ending, one that heavily implied Deckard was human. This, of course, undermines the whole point of the movie, which was to question what makes us human. The studio also recorded a bunch of voiceover exposition from Deckard without Scott's approval, but the voiceover was so clumsy that even Ford himself hated it. One particularly atrocious moment saw Batty's death followed by some musings from Deckard, essentially killing the mood in the film's most famous scene.
I don't know why he saved my life. Maybe in those last moments he loved life more than he ever had before.
Originally, I Am Legend was meant to end the same way as the book on which it was based. Dr. Robert Neville would realize that the monsters he spent the whole movie fighting were actually afraid of him.
I'm sorry.
Unfortunately, that original ending was changed in a big way after a few rounds of test screenings. As director Francis Lawrence explained to Screen Rant, "We tested it twice and it got wildly rejected, which is why we came out with the other one." Apparently, audiences didn't want to see Neville confronting the moral ambiguity of his actions, instead demanding a traditional action movie climax in which Will Smith sacrifices himself to blow up the bad guys. Needless to say, the theatrical cut of I Am Legend changes the meaning of the entire movie. The whole point of the book is to say that by treating these undead creatures as less than human, the hero becomes a monster himself. Yet the movie tosses out this nuance in favor of spectacle. In retrospect, Lawrence told the Happy Sad Confused podcast that he preferred the darker ending, and he thinks audiences would have preferred it too.
I feel like everybody went to see The Last Man on Earth and enjoyed it for that reason and would have still enjoyed it with the nihilistic ending.
Scott Pilgrim vs. the World was originally supposed to have a very different ending. After spending the entire film courting Ramona Flowers, Scott was to realize that he needs to let go of her and stay with knives.
Well, I'm buying stuff. Yeah, and stuff.
But this wasn't popular at test screenings. As director Edgar Wright recorded an interview with Collider, one audience member said, "I love this film. I love every scene and I love every character. I really do not like that ending." So Wright shot a new ending, in which knives give Scott a blessing to be with Ramona.
Go get her. What? You've been fighting for her all along.
Wright later pointed out, "As soon as we test screened the new ending, the scores went up again. This feel-good ending may have satisfied the test audience, but it removed a great deal of growth from Scott's character. Arguably, the film would have been stronger if Scott had realized knives was better for him after all. Or it could have taken a direction similar to the Scott Pilgrim comics, in which Scott ends up with Ramona after all, but not before going through some much-needed self-reflection. In the comics, Scott's face-off against his evil doppelganger, Nega Scott, was more than just a joke. It symbolized Scott confronting his own flaws. A movie this smart and subversive deserved an equally subversive ending, but test audiences wanted to see the boy get the girl, so that's exactly what we got. Fatal Attraction is a classic example of a movie with an alternate ending that's much better than the theatrical version. In the film's original climax, Alex was originally meant to kill herself and frame her lover, Dan, for her murder.
I don't know what I'll do, but it's gonna be something terrible.
Instead, the theatrical version has Alex become totally unhinged and attack Dan with a knife. And, well, you have test audiences to thank for that. As Michael Douglas told the New York Times, the audience viscerally wanted to kill Alex, not allow her to kill herself. Glenn Close later revealed that she was outraged when she learned the filmmakers wanted to change the ending. She told the New York Times, "It was going to make a character I loved into a murdering psychopath. I loved the original ending. I always felt Alex was more suicidal than psychotic. This is certainly more in line with how Alex acts in the rest of the movie. All of her choices come from a desperate need to be loved, and this shows in Close's performance. Yes, when Alex picks up the knife and starts slashing, she becomes a monster instead of a character. Many would argue that portraying Alex as a hysterical killer only reinforces unfortunate stereotypes about women and mental illness. On top of that, it conveniently sidesteps Dan's partial culpability in the affair. The original version would have ended the movie on a more bittersweet and realistic note. Focus groups weren't happy with the original climax of A Perfect Murder, resulting in a new ending for the final film. In both versions, Emily reveals to her husband, Stephen, that she has evidence proving that he hired a man to kill her. In the theatrical version, Stephen physically attacks Emily to make sure his secret doesn't get out, and she shoots him in self-defense. In the alternate ending, however, Stephen only verbally threatens Emily before she shoots him, after she tells the police she shot him because he was attacking her.
What else could you do?
In other words, Emily's killing of Stephen seems to be premeditated, adding some moral ambiguity to her character. Director Andrew Davis later told Yahoo, "I liked that ending, but test audiences felt she was more empathetic if she killed her husband in self-defense. It's only a slight change, but it makes a world of difference. In the safer ending, Emily is little more than a victim. In the alternate ending, she's also a victim, but one who is willing to do anything to escape her abusive husband." Brian De Palma's thriller Snake Eyes originally ended with a giant tidal wave taking out the bad guy. Thanks to a test screening, however, De Palma had to come up with a rather underwhelming alternate ending. Instead of narrowly escaping a wave of biblical proportions, protagonist Rick ducks almost comically to the ground to pass underneath a speeding vehicle, after which the villain simply shoots himself. Describing his original vision for the ending to IndieWire, De Palma said, "We were dealing with such a corrupt world that the only way to solve the problem is to have a hurricane come through and wipe it all away. But it didn't work in the preview, so we did this other ending which I don't think is as effective. The theatrical cut is still fun, but not nearly as subversive as the alternate version. The finalized ending is also a little anticlimactic, not least because there's plenty of foreshadowing for the great hurricane in the film that never really amounts to anything. In the final scene, for example, Rick says,
I keep dreaming I'm back in that tunnel, underwater. Only in my dream I drowned."
But in the theatrical cut, he never was underwater. De Palma told IndieWire that if he was ever invited to release a director's cut of Snake Eyes, he'd want to put that scene back in. The original ending of A Fish Called Wanda would have had con artist Wanda kiss Archie, the would-be victim with whom she fell in love, but the camera would then have panned down to show Wanda's shoes, designed to look like sharks. A symbolic reminder to viewers that even now, Wanda was playing Archie. Sadly, it wasn't to be. In an interview with Vanity Fair, Jamie Lee Curtis explained, "What happened is we showed the movie to audiences and they loved the movie, hated the ending. The relationship between Archie and Wanda was so real and people were rooting for them. So the filmmakers added a few scenes to leave no ambiguity that Wanda truly did love Archie." Curtis, however, much prefers the original ending. She told Vanity Fair, "I loved the sort of truth bite that John had written, a darker, much darker, more sinister ending." Focus groups aren't solely to blame for the mess that is Last Action Hero, as the problems with this movie began as early as pre-production, but they certainly didn't help. The feedback from test audiences and the changes enacted afterwards exemplify everything that went wrong with this film. As producer and star Arnold Schwarzenegger explained to Roger Ebert, "Our movie was a big hit with the test screenings, but there was one thing that was very clear. The audience did not like to see my vulnerability. They wanted me to kick in gear and get the action going. Yet by giving audiences what they wanted, the filmmakers may have undermined the whole point of the movie. Last Action Hero was originally meant to be a satire of action movies."
I'll be back. Ha! You did not gonna say that, did you?
That's what you always say.
The original version would have put more emphasis on how young Danny loses himself in violent action movies to avoid dealing with the grief of losing his father. Between the page and the screen, however, that concept played an increasingly smaller role in the movie. These test audiences may have even impacted the poor box office of Last Action Hero. The movie's reputation preceded it, sinking it before it could even launch. Schwarzenegger later told We Minored in Film, "You can't have people just like your movie. We need them to be passionate. Word of mouth is what makes movies big." Poor Ridley Scott can't seem to catch a break. Test audiences ruined not just Blade Runner, but also his 1985 fantasy film Legend. Scott recalled in the DVD commentary for the Legend Ultimate Edition that at one screening, there were 2 audience members smoking and jeering at the screen. Determined to reach a wider audience, he cut down the runtime from over 2 hours to 90 minutes. Along the way, he replaced the entire score of the movie, switching out Jerry Goldsmith's haunting orchestral music for an instrumental score from the electronic band Tangerine Dream. You may think that changing the background music of a film may not make much of a difference, but it has a huge impact on the finished product. For example, after the male unicorn is killed, Goldsmith's score conveys the wordless rage of the female unicorn mourning her mate, while Tangerine Dream's score contains a vaguely sad and ethereal clip of music that doesn't quite match the mood. Looking back, Scott regrets compromising his vision. He told The Guardian, "People said Legend didn't work, but I think it does work. I just made it 25 years too soon." The original ending of Little Shop of Horrors is tragic and absolutely bonkers. The hero Seymour gets swallowed by a man-eating plant, which then proceeds to germinate until the entire world is consumed by carnivorous plants. But focus groups didn't take kindly to that ending. Director Frank Oz told Entertainment Weekly, "For every musical number, there was applause. They loved it. It was just fantastic until we killed our two leads, and then the theater became a refrigerator, an icebox." Reluctantly, Oz agreed to shoot a happy ending, even though it meant discarding a sequence that had cost nearly 20% of the movie's budget. Sadly, this last-minute change had a huge impact on the movie. After all, the original stage musical kills off the hero, and really, it's hard to imagine the story ending any other way. Little Shop of Horrors is meant to be a cautionary tale. Seymour keeps feeding the plant human flesh, and along the way, Seymour feeds his own ego, so it's a fitting end for Seymour to be eaten himself. Thankfully for fans, the long-lost original ending was later restored and shown in theaters.